Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing female solidarity and friendship in Victorian literature. I've been really pondering this subject over the past year because I've just noticed a lot more female friendships and just good relationships and interactions between women in Victorian literature, and I feel like in a lot of ways, Victorian writers almost seem to appreciate the power and strength that comes from women who are united as friends, as sisters, mothers and daughters. And I just really thought it would be fun to explore that a little bit. In a lot of ways, this video will kind of just be me exploring several different books and the female friendships and interactions within those books. However, I do have some level of organization to this discussion. So let's start off by discussing how female friendship and solidarity is explored in Victorian literature, at least, of course, as far as what I've read. Obviously, there are plenty of books, I'm sure, that also include this sort of topic that I may not bring up here, partly because I already have 12 books I'm going to talk about and I want to keep this video to a reasonable length, but also I may just not have read it. So if you have any recommendations or any thoughts on other books that have really good female friendships and interactions in them, please let me know. I am always looking for more of this in my life. One of the earliest books I think a lot of people end up reading when they get into Victorian literature, even if it's not the first one, it tends to be one of the earlier ones, is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. I guess I should also mention that there will be minor spoilers for these books that I'll discuss, so I'll mention the book first, hold it up, and then you can just skip forward until I've put it down. There will of course not be any massive spoilers, but if you really want to avoid any information about some of these books, just be aware of that. Early on in Jane Eyre, we watch her meet Helen at Lowood School, and this is a relationship that is so critical to not only just her gaining confidence and gaining a relationship that is positive in her life, but also in her becoming who she is. This book is called Jane Eyre because it is really about Jane in my eyes. Yes, Mr. Rochester plays a really big role, but in a lot of ways he's sort of just a catalyst for continuing to develop Jane in a lot of ways. Not completely, obviously he's very pivotal and key and he has his own characteristics, so I don't want to diminish his character, but we're really following Jane and her growth and who she is as a person through all of these different circumstances. And Helen is so central to her becoming who she is, to her recognizing what's important, what's not, to her having integrity. She's also a very stabilizing force for Jane. She grew up in this really abusive home, so Helen represents a break from that. Even after Helen passes away, Jane continually thinks back on her, and she represents, the memory of her, I guess, represents a stabilizing force for Jane, for her to remember who she is and what she stands for. Additionally, we see a similar sort of friendship, at least as far as what the relationship brings to each of the individuals, in Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This book primarily focuses on Bathsheba Everdene, at least she's the catalyst for a lot of the plot that goes on. However, when she's able to rise up in society, she ends up making friends with her maid, Liddy. And I do feel like even though Bathsheba is very, very flawed, Liddy does represent an opportunity for her to come down to earth when she needs to vent when she needs to. She really trusts Liddy to help her to succeed. Obviously, at the time, turning to a man on the farm would have been questionable and not very acceptable. So she really only has Liddy to turn to, but I also feel like there's something very special about the fact that she clearly really does trust Liddy herself. It's not just the fact that she's the only one there. Liddy is just very supportive, and Bathsheba really thrives with that. And we're able to see how those qualities within female friendship continue into elderly age with Crandford, of course, by Elizabeth Gaskell. This book is all about this group of old ladies who are living in this town. They're all widows or have never married, and they just really support each other even in their old age. They help each other out when there's some difficult situations going on. Of the ones I've mentioned so far, I feel like this one is probably one of the more balanced relationships. Obviously, there's more than two people involved in this one, but all of them are loving and serving each other. They're doing everything they can for each other within, obviously, their own means. Whereas the first two, like I mentioned, Helen is really good for Jane, but I mean, Helen benefited from Jane as well, but I don't think we get to see that as much. And then I feel like with Liddy and Bathsheba, that Bathsheba really is the only one getting a lot of the support out of it, because I don't feel like Liddy ends up receiving much from Bathsheba besides a wage. So this is definitely a much more balanced relationship that is shown showcased in this story. But the bond between these women is just so astounding and wonderful to read about. That's definitely the best part of this book for me. I unfortunately didn't love it as much as a lot of other people do, but I did find it charming at points, and I did really like the relationship amongst these women. And I love the way Elizabeth Gaskell explored the power of female relationships like this. Of course, it's not only female friendship that is explored in Victorian literature, also just female connections and interactions are really beautifully explored in Victorian literature. One scene that really sticks out to me is from Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. I honestly don't remember a lot about this book. It's not my favorite Dickens, at least as of this point. I'd be happy to reread it in the future and hopefully enjoy it better then. But as of right now, it's definitely towards the bottom of my list, if not at the bottom, probably. But one of the most memorable things in this book was a scene between Nancy and Rose. In this conversation, Rose is trying to help Nancy. I believe Nancy ends up bringing her information about something, and Rose in her turn wants to help Nancy out of her terrible situation. Nancy is a prostitute. She also is in a very abusive relationship, and Rose is trying to help her, but Nancy basically explains that she's too far gone. There's nothing that can really be done for her at this point, and it's a very heartbreaking conversation. But you also see how these two women begin to recognize and understand each other. Even just in this one conversation, they're really able to connect. And obviously at the time, men and women couldn't connect on this level very fast because obviously that was just a big no-no. So other women were where these connections were able to happen, where these honest conversations were able to happen. And so you really see that in this book, that they just understand each other very quickly and have a lot of respect for each other despite their different classes. And I just really loved that conversation and felt like it really showcased that power of just female relationships in general. No matter how long lasting they are, just women being put together can create connections and understanding that are just beautiful and wonderful to read about, as well as experience honestly in real life. Another book I wanted to mention that explores female friendship and relationship in a few different ways is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Brontë. In this story, we have Helen Graham, of course, and she is in a very difficult family situation throughout this book. However, she's not alone because she has a friend who also is in a very similar situation, and they're able to really connect with each other. They're not able to vocalize everything they want to, but they just both understand each other. Going back to that scene in Oliver Twist, these two women, despite the fact that they can't communicate all that they're feeling, they communicate enough that they're able to understand each other and provide comfort and encouragement even when they're not even in the same place, in the same building. In a lot of ways, letters from her friend is all Helen Graham has to uphold her throughout a huge chunk of this book. And in fact, I think that connection with a female friend really saved her in so many ways throughout this experience, because I think she would have just been lost to despair if she didn't have some sort of connection like that. Additionally, a much smaller piece of this book is that the young man who is originally our narrator in this book starts off having an affection for a local girl. However, when he meets Helen Graham, he starts to be more interested in her. She's an older, more mature woman, very mysterious. And at one point, he even says something a little bit derogatory about the woman that he originally was interested in. And Helen takes the time to suggest to him that maybe this young girl, this woman, has more to her than he's giving her credit for. And I just really appreciated this moment, because obviously Helen has her own reasons for not wanting to get into a romantic relationship with Gilbert, but she still cares about him, and I feel like just her kindness towards this other woman shows what she's learned through her experiences. That idea that women need to stick together as much as possible, and obviously this young woman may not treat Helen very well, but Helen is going to treat her well because she recognizes that women really need each other. And I just really love that moment. I just feel like it shows a great deal of respect and kindness that I feel like would not exist in a lot of things, especially in recent times. A lot of stories, television, movies, books, a lot of the time we just have these catty women who are very different and just do not like each other and don't treat each other well. And I just liked that little moment of just kindness and respect, because she recognizes that, like I said, women really need each other. I also feel like there are a few characters that I've seen who maybe aren't the best of people, women women in particular, obviously, who are maybe not very kind or good, but the one positive thing about them is that they do something kind for another woman. For example, Becky Sharp from Vanity Fair is atrocious and manipulative and cunning and wonderful to read about, but not a good person. But I feel like the only time she shows real care and emotion for another person is towards the end of this book. Without direct spoilers, towards the end of this book, Amelia is in a position where she has a few options, pretty much to either stay with Becky in this really unfortunate situation or to go off and find perhaps a greater happiness elsewhere. And Becky goes out of her way to convince Amelia to leave. Of course, you could argue she has some of her own reasons. Maybe she wants just Amelia out of the way for certain reasons. But when I read that scene, I really felt that she genuinely cared about Amelia and recognized that there was this path that Amelia needed to take, that Becky really wanted her to end up being happy and recognized that this was the best option for her. And in this entire book, Becky Sharp doesn't do anything good, really, except for that one kindness and thoughtfulness towards Amelia. And I just love that the one good positive thing, one good moment she's had was with another woman, again showing just that power and connection and understanding that lies within these sorts of relationships. I also feel like I see a lot more women who are just not petty with each other in Victorian literature. Obviously there are women in Victorian literature who are petty towards each other and not very kind, but I do feel like there's just a greater respect amongst female characters in Victorian literature than I often see in more recent literature. A good example of this is Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Tess ends up winning the heart of a young man who is very much pined after by other ladies around her, who also happen to be her friends, and they could easily be very jealous, could easily just brush her aside and be upset that she lied to them, that she took what they really wanted, but they're not like that. Rather, they're very understanding and respectful of her, and even later on in the book when she ends up in a really unfortunate position, it's these friends that do what they can to reach out to the person who can best help her, despite knowing what has happened to Tess in the past, something that really has turned many other people away. They know who she is, and it's really them who are the only ones that recognize who Tess is and that nothing in her past changes who she is. Everybody else, her parents, these other men in her life, other people in her community, all see her differently because of this event in her past that really she had no control over. But her female friends are the ones who recognize who she is, who hang on to who she is, who don't let that get in the way, and I love that so much. It was one of my favorite things in this last reread that I noticed, and I absolutely love it. Of course, the strength between women can also lead to very unfortunate circumstances as well, and lead women into trouble, and they do in a lot of Victorian novels. For example, we have Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. In this one, there are some positive female relationships. However, Molly Gibson's stepmother, Hyacinth, and her daughter, her stepsister, Molly's stepsister, Cynthia, end up being pretty manipulative and derogatory, but she has to rely on them in a lot of ways, especially Cynthia, because she has some level of trust and respect for Cynthia, but this ends up leading Molly into situations she'd rather not be in because she has this connection to her stepsister. Another example of female relationships that have so much power that one of them ends up manipulating it is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. We all know, of course, about Miss Havisham and Estella, her ward. And unfortunately, Miss Havisham is so torn apart by grief and heartbreak and a desire for vengeance that she ends up imposing that on Estella. And Estella then grows up to be very unhappy in a lot of ways because she has been raised in such a bitter and hateful place, and a lot of it can be very humorous, especially in this book, very satirical. But ultimately, this relationship that Miss Havisham and Estella have lead them both to despair and doesn't really help either of them. It just spurs on the fire, as it were. There's also some representations that I want to discuss of how a lack of female connection can really hinder a woman's growth and happiness in a lot of ways. One example is Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Both older Catherine and younger Catherine grow up without really many female influences. Obviously, they both have Nellie, and because Nellie is specifically a little bit more involved with younger Catherine, she ends up a little bit better. But while they do turn to her in a lot of situations where they need to vent and discuss certain things, they don't fully trust her with everything. She's still a servant, and so there's not that friendship connection in any way. And everybody else around is pretty much men. I guess Isabella is maybe the one exception, but she's so mousy and quiet that there's not really any solid connection there, and so they don't have any women to positively influence them, to guide them and explain society to them, and so it ends up leading to some naivete, some inappropriate behavior, unkind behavior. Obviously, this also leads to some really interesting discussions of gender roles at the time and dynamics, but specifically for this conversation, it does cause a lot of problems for both of them, not having that connection, particularly in the society. Luckily, younger Catherine is able to break away from sort of that cycle, but it takes a long time and it takes multiple connections with other people to make it happen. Another big theme in Victorian literature is marriage, and specifically unhappiness in marriage. And I think often it's discussed that marriage itself as an institution is something that's wrong with society. At least that seems to be where a lot of Victorian works tend to lean. However, I've noticed a bit of a pattern wherein a lot of these unhappy marriages are unhappy in part because the wife is separated from all of her female friendships and connections. She may be able to still write letters, obviously, and see them at different functions, but there's a separation there where she's not able to get as intimate with them as she maybe was able to before her marriage. And this leads to a lot of heartbreak and loneliness for the woman, which in turn can impact the man's happiness because his wife is clearly struggling. She may become very irritable. That is a common symptom of depression. A couple examples of this that I will actually end this video on. The first one is The Odd Women by George Gissing. This story follows several women, one of whom ends up getting married. Two of the other women in the story are actually her sisters, and she's not able to have the same connection to them, the same relationship to them that she was able to have before. She also doesn't really have many strong connections outside of those sisters. She doesn't have female friends coming to visit her regularly, having good discussions with them or anything. She's very separated from them. And this ends up leading to a lot of heartbreak for her and ultimately for her husband as well, because she's not living life the way she had hoped to, and she's not feeling that fulfillment of female friendship and connection. Another one that also showcases this is The Half-Sisters by Geraldine Jewsbury. Again, there are two women involved in this story. One ends up getting married, the other one does not. She ends up following a very different path in life. But the one that gets married is the one who really ends up in a lot of ways being unhappy. She's very bored, she's very lonely, she doesn't have, again, those connections until actually the second woman involved in this story comes into her life a little bit. It's very, very minor, but you see how much that little bit of connection to a fellow woman brightens this woman's life. And I feel like I'm glad I'm ending on this one because it shows both sides so well, how that lack of connection can cause so much heartbreak and pain, but on the other side, how just a little bit of connection between women can just change everything, just brighten everything up, even if it's just for a moment. And I just adore how Victorian literature explores that, and I'm just glad that I've been able to think a little bit about this year. So that is everything I have to talk to you about today. Again, let me know down below your thoughts on this topic. If there's any other books that I didn't mention that you'd like to recommend as possible examples of what I've been talking about here, I always love recommendations, and even if it's a book I already want to read, it could move it a little bit more up my priority list. So like I said, definitely give me those. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful Victober, and I will see you next time. Bye!